My name is Nuno, and today I'm here to speak to you about writing effective PHP. First of all, a little bit about myself. I do a lot of open source. Last year, I've made more than 3,200 open source contributions, which is a lot. I also have created some successful open source packages, which are used for millions of developers. Let me show you a couple of them. One is called Collision. And this Collision package has been downloaded more than 5 million times. It's included on the Laravel core, the framework, and you can better debug applications with this console tool. I'm also the creator of one of the most popular CLI frameworks in PHP, which is Laravel 0, where you can actually have console applications with this beautiful interface. I also have built a PHP stand extension for Laravel. It's basically something that can understand the Laravel magic and also report some errors. And most recently, PHP Insights. And PHP Insights can give you this beautiful interface about your project. You can see PHP Insights as PHPCS with steroids in this beautiful interface. So, during the day, I do work for a company called Algulia, which is a search as a service company that you might have used before in some websites, such as twitch.com or stripe.com. That being said, let's get started. I'm here today to speak to you about writing effective PHP. Writing effective PHP is my opinionated way on defensive programming. I believe that developers today, they code assuming that others do not commit mistakes. And defensive programming is quite of the opposite of this. You code that assuming that others may commit mistakes. So you protect your code against bad practices and also against bad usages. You assume the worst. When you enter in this mood of defensive programming, you assume that every single line of code can be a liability. If you want me to make an analogy here, you can see it as just like driving. When you drive careful. You pay attention. You do to the left, you look to the right before you advance. So driving, you kind of assume that others may commit mistakes. In defensive programming, coding like defensive programming is just like this. I'm about to give you a set of practices that if you follow them, they will get you in the habit of writing robust, testable, safe, and maintainable code. At the end of the day, with those practices that I'm about to give you, you want to prevent every possible bug within your application. Before, I want to give a quick warning on this. There is no such thing as practices by default. Every practice depends from your team or from your project. And the practices that I'm about to give you, they are defensive practices. Most of the time, you don't need them. At the end of this talk, I'm going to give you some more concrete examples where you need defensive programming. All right, so let's get started. We are going to do some live coding here today. We are going to work with two classes. The first class is the class money. Actually, I want to make sure that everyone in the room can see the code right now, even on the back. All good, right? All right. So we are going to work with two classes. The first class is the class money. And the money is a simple value object, which means that you can pass the amount of money through the constructor. You can set, if you want, a different amount, but you can also get the amount. So the money value object is just an object that carries the state about the money. Let's go to the second class. The second class is the money standard class, which is, this time, an object that carries some behavior with her. You can pass the money through the constructor, and later, if you want to, you call the method handle to actually send the money to somebody else. So again, the class money value object and the class money sender. Let's use this in the real application. Here I have an HTTP route. And in the first line, I'm actually instantiating a new money value object with $100. Afterwards, I'm going to create a new money sender with $100. Later, I'm setting a different amount of 50 in the same money class. And then I pass those $50 to this money sender. Looking at the first glance in this code, the money sender 100 will send $100, and the money sender 50 will send $50. At the first glance, this code was expected. When I run this code into my browser, you will see that I'm actually sending $50 twice, which is a clear bug within my application. The problem is, actually the money object is the reference to the money object is being shared between those two money senders. Which means that when I'm changing the amount to 50, I'm actually changing the amount to both money senders, which is a clear bug. And also leads us to the first tip of the day. Make state immutable. This is a very common thing in languages such as Java and C# because they need thread safety. Still, having mutable objects in languages such as PHP is the reason of many bugs in software. PHP, even though doesn't need thread safety, having mutable objects is the reason of many bugs in the industry of software. For those who don't know, an immutable class cannot change after being created. On the other hand, a mutable class can change after being created. So I want to make an open question to the audience here. Who is the person responsible of this bug? Is the new developer in your team that just have introduced this line right here, or the developer who have coded the money value object because he could have made it immutable from the first place? If the money value object had been immutable from the first place, this bug would never happen. So how can we actually make immutable classes? The rule of thumb is the constructor is the only injection point. And that means no public attributes, no setters, and you make sure the state is private. The new developer in your team, actually when he's using this money value object, he cannot change the state of the money value object as is immutable. You'll be forced to actually create a new instance of money, this time with $50. And the bug is now gone. But we all agree that we could have prevented this from happening, making classes immutable. Just to recap, constructor is the only injection point, no setters, private attributes, and you make sure the state is private. Let's go to the second rule today. Always assert. If you get back to the code, if I actually pass a negative amount here, I can send a negative amount, which is a clear violation to my domain, a clear violation to my business. And the same question comes up. Who, again, is the responsible of this bug? Is the new developer within your team or the developer who could have made sure that when somebody creates a new money value object, we'll have the correct state? So here, in a money value object, what the developer should have done is make sure that, all right, if someone uses my object, I'm only allowing that if it passes me the correct data. If the data it passes have the correct state. So what you can do is basically saying, all right, if the amount is negative, I'm going to throw an invalid argument exception, saying that the amount must be positive. Now, the new developer in your team, when he's using this code, he will see immediately, all right, I cannot use this object in this way. I must actually pass a positive amount of money. And you will be forced to use the code correctly. Right? On the context of defensive programming, when you should assert, I would say always. And you might want to build your own helpers to avoid some code duplication. Or, if you want to, consider the package verbally assert. On the package verbally assert, you can actually validate arguments. Here, for example, if I want to create something, and I want to make sure that the name is not empty, I just call the function not empty. Since PHP is not strongly typed, if you want to make sure that objects are always from the same type, you can actually make sure that they are always instance of. Let's move to another tip today. If you have a public API, make sure you write a clear contract. And keep in mind that this is not the public API from your HTTP request, but is the public API from your code, from your classes, from your objects. Let's get back here. If I go to the money value object, if it wasn't you writing this code, you look at this amount, what exactly amount means? It can be an integer, it can be a float, it can be an object. We have no idea. But not only with the signature, also with the behavior. Let's go here to the money sender, the handle method. What exactly the handle method is doing? And often we hear people saying that the code should speak for itself. I think that's bullshit in my opinion, right? So also the behavior. I mean, the signature I think is quite clear. I don't need to pass nothing, and I don't expect nothing. Still, we also need to documentate the behavior. And especially in open source context, people rely in your code. If you change the behavior, you are making a breaking change. It means that that public contract needs to be defined somewhere. How can you define a public contract? It's actually super simple. You just use PHP docs. So here, in the headers of this class, you can say, this is a value object that represents the money. It sounds simple, but when you do this, the person reading your code, you know immediately this object has zero behavior. It just carries the state of the information about the money. And the same goes for the constructor. Here you would say, create a new instance of money. The amount is an integer, so people know exactly what to pass here. If you want, you can use type-ins. I really don't care. And the description, you say, that must be positive. And again, people know exactly that you must pass a type-int, an int that must be positive. You may be careful, though, because I may throw an invalid argument exception when the amount is negative. People know exactly how to interact with your code with this kind of public API. And if you are an open source maintainer, you also know when you are making a breaking change. Because if you change this public API, you are making a breaking change. And same goes for the behavior. Here, I must say, create a new database record and sends an email. And the same history comes. If you change the public API, if you are sending an email, if you are not sending an email anymore, you are making a breaking change. And to make you understand the level of granularity that I want you to put on a public API, let's make an example here. Here I have this admin repository, which is just a class that returns a list of emails. In the traditional way, the way of doing this is gets the list of emails, and you would say, all right, it returns an array. What I want you to do is actually create value objects, but still imagine that you are doing this in legacy code. The first problem here is that looking at this public contract, I don't know the value of within the array, right? Can be an integer, can be a string, can be an object. I have no idea. Some of you may say, all right, just use the PHP docs official annotation, which is an array of strings, right? Still, what exactly is the key, right? Because if I want to actually send the name of the user here, what exactly is the key, right? Something that I'm using more recently is kind of the generics annotation that is actually supported by PHP Stan, but also by PHP Storm. So what you can do is say, all right, I'm going to return an array, but within this array, I expect something like a string within the key, but also a string within the value. And this is a good public contract because people know exactly what to expect from the key, but also exactly what to expect from the value. And since you are talking about PHP docs, please never write PHP docs like this. All right? Those PHP docs add zero value to your source code, and they are not funny at all, right? One core principle on defensive programming is that you never hide bugs from your software. If something doesn't work, if something is not available, you always throw an exception, and you let the software handle the exception properly. All right? So, for those of you who would say that I do open source, if you do open source and if you use semantic versioning, please declare your public API. Otherwise, it's not clear when you are making a minor, a patch, or a breaking change. And people want to know what exactly they can rely on. And to write a solid contract, you write what it is, what it does, what it returns, what is the behavior of the method, but also the behavior when you violate the contract, so people can catch exceptions and handle the problem properly. Another topic today is no optional dependencies. People think that sometimes to provide an optional feature, you need to provide an optional dependency. And it's not good. I'm going to make an example for you. Imagine that in this money sender, you want to add a new feature. And the new feature is you want to log something when you are actually sending money. The traditional way of doing this would be create a new attribute for the logger, pass the logger through the constructor, and afterwards, on the handle method, you probably would say logger info sending money. This is the way of doing things, right? Pass the dependencies through the constructor, and everything will work as expected. Now, the problem comes when people want to make this optional. And the traditional way of making optional is actually allow a null here. From the moment you start doing this, let's see what happens to your code. So here, you probably need to, all right, let's do an if condition, because if logger is exactly null, is different from null, I would say, I want to actually, save the logger here. But also, if, this is actually this here. If the logger exists in the current class, I want to log something. Now, I'm seeing multiple problems here. First one is the cyclomatic complexity with your code, which will increase. And to make some context here, the cyclomatic complexity is a code metric for quality. To make it simple, if you have a linear method with one possible outcome, the cyclomatic complexity will be 1. If you have an if condition like this, the cyclomatic complexity will be 2, as it is 2 possible outcomes from this method. One where the log is actually logging something, but also one when the logger is also not logging something. All right? That's a problem, but also testing issue, right? There is 2 possible outcomes here, means that I need 2 tests. So what's the solution for this? If I want to provide an optional feature, how can I avoid an optional dependency? And the solution for this is using actually null object pattern, which means that here, you still say, all right, if you want to, you can pass me a logger. But if you don't have a logger, no worries. This is logger here, by the way. If you don't have a logger, no worries. I will still use the one logger myself. This logger is just a null object pattern, which means that is an object that respects an interface that does nothing. All right? It doesn't actually log something. So here, you can remove this if condition, and cyclomatic complexity plus testing, we are solved there, right? We still managed to make it simple. All right, let's move forward. Just remove here. Another topic that I wanted to bring here today, especially because there is so many controversy on Twitter about this, is make classes final by default. Should we do it in normal applications? Probably not. Still, on defensive programming context, you should do it by default. And I'm going to make you 2 examples. On the open source, you might want to hide the internals of the class to make the public API smaller. And to make everyone in the same room, a final class cannot be extended. When you mark a class as final, you cannot extend that class later on. Which means that on open source, it is especially useful, as you hide the internals from the public API. You are able to modify those internals. But still, in some web applications on your local project, I still find the value on this. So I want to make an example for you today. And to start things off, an open question. Is this software well designed? Take a quick look. I think everyone here in the room would say this software is not well designed. It's a clear violation to object programming. But for those of you who are actually confused, I'm going to make it even more simple for you. Just because Nuno is food doesn't mean, just because Nuno needs food doesn't mean Nuno is food. All right? Just because Nuno needs food to be able to eat doesn't mean that Nuno is actually food. And this is the way that some developers find to solve their problems. They need to make Nuno eat, and to make things faster, they extend from food, and now they can call the method eat. And again, this is a violation to object programming oriented, right? So how can you actually enforce good practices here? One idea would be you mark the class food as final. And from this point, it cannot be extended. And developers who need to implement the method eat on Nuno, they actually be forced to pass food through the constructor of Nuno because they cannot extend it. And it will be forced to think about composition over inheritance. All right?
Yeah, but Nuno doesn't think you want only one kind of food. Pasta, pizza.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can extend food, pizza, and
Yeah. Let's probably bring the discussion afterwards. So, on the context of defensive programming, when you should mark classes as final? I would say probably always, and you force your team to think about composition this time. Another topic that I wanted to bring here today is high-quality tests. Because I think we often hear the expression that my software have 100% on the test suite, so I'm safe. And I question, do you really have 100% of test suite? Let's take a look at an example here. This handle method, looking at this, I have 2 tests, at least to make 100% of test suite coverage. One test that actually tests the behavior of the method, that asserts that, yes, I'm creating a database record and I'm sending an email, but also a test that tests that when something is not working, I'm throwing an exception. 2 possible outcomes, 2 tests. Now, if I come to this code, if I'm returning a Boolean instead of a void, I have 3 possible outcomes. 1 for exception, 1 when I get true, and another one when I get false. Still, with 2 tests, I have 100% of test suite coverage. So to have it right, you actually need 3 tests, test all the possible outcomes, is in this moment, when you master high-quality test suite, that you will be imploring for less features. Returning a Boolean is different from returning a void. And you want to implore for less features to write less tests, to make the code simple, and you reduce everything to the bare minimum. One topic that was actually already spoken in this conference is static analysis. I believe that static analysis in PHP will grow massively in the next coming years. Reason is, we always had static analysis in other languages, such as Java and C#. We call it the compiler, right? The compiler, among other things, is also trying to find bugs within your code before actually deploying it to production. And you can still leverage this in other languages as PHP, Ruby, and Python using static analysis tools, such as PHP Stan or PHP Insights, which is a tool that I realized some weeks ago. Let me demo PHP Stan for you. You can install actually PHP Stan within your project in PHP. Then you run vendor bin PHP Stan analyze. And what it does is basically going through your project and try to find bugs for you. Let's introduce a bug here. Let's pass a string here instead of an integer. When I run this code into PHP Stan, you will say, hey, be careful though, you are trying to pass a string here, but I do expect an integer. Is not this thing huge? And the same goes if I try to instantiate something that doesn't exist. I run this code on PHP Stan, and again, it will warn us that, hey, you are trying to instantiate a class that doesn't exist. You might need to perform something here. Is not this thing massive? Instead of actually having your team trying to find bugs within your code, in your production code, you can actually rely on one tool to try to find it in milliseconds to run the first inspection. Another tool that I have built 1 week ago is called PHP Insights. Someone here already have heard about PHP Insights. Can raise your hand? All right, probably 10 people. So it's cool. I'm able to demo to you. I've realized it PHP Insights 2 weeks ago. And what it is that you install it in your PHP project, and immediately you can run it through the terminal. So PHP Insights gives you this beautiful overview about your project. And you can see it as PHP CS with steroids, but also with those metrics that can indicate what's going on in your project. especially useful if you are trying to enter within a new project. Here, as you can see, you have metrics on the code quality, on the complexity, on the architecture, but also about the styling. Keep in mind that behind the scenes, PHP 10 detects your framework, which means that if you are working with Symfony or Laravel, I'm going to run a special preset for you, tailored for your framework, for your project. Then you can see that within these lines, most of my lines are actually comments. You also know the average of the cyclomatic complexity that I explained it to you a couple of minutes ago. So you can understand if your project is actually complex or not. And the same goes for the architecture. You can actually understand how the code is split within your project. And here I can see that within this application, most of my files are actually classes. Finally, I do also have the understanding about the coding style, which is, again, tailored per framework, WordPress, Drupal, and also the security issues, which is something really nice. In the end, you can actually see the detail of the security issues within your application. And those are security issues related to your dependencies. After seeing this recap, you can actually click on Enter. When you click on Enter, you have this list about things that you need to improve, to actually improve the code quality. And here you can see, I actually do some recommendations on defensive programming. And see, hey, here, you might not use public properties. Please use a method access instead. And same here, I'm saying that setters are not allowed. Please use constructor injection. But also tips on the readability. Here I'm saying that you have a variable with the name of G. You might want to rename it to something more clear, more readable. I click on Enter, and I'm going to see the complexity issues. Here, I do know that I do have a method with height of cyclomatic complexity that I may want to refactor it to make it simple. I click on Enter, and I enter in the architectural issues on my application. I'm seeing that this class is probably doing too much. I probably need a refactor here. I also have a function which is too long, so I probably want a separation of concerns here. Finally, the style issues, which is basically spacing in all of those things that you can fix with your CS fixer. And at the end, you have the security issues. And here I can clearly see that the Symfony HTTP Foundation within the version which is on my composer.json have a security issue that I may want to address here. Probably upgrade the dependency should be enough to fix this security issue. All right? PHP Insights was realized 2 weeks ago. Actually, it gained quite of popularity. You may want to check it on phpinsights.com. So, to recap, how to have high-quality testing? You had 100% of real test coverage. And also, use and abuse of static analysis. And to keep it really clear, every time you ignore static analysis on PHP, you are losing money. You might want to only consider those practices. And those practices, they are quite useful for open source libraries, where your code will be distributed among other developers. You might want to have sensitive code there, so please consider those practices. Also important pieces of your software. If you're handling money, email transactions, you might want to be safe here. And also, for long-lived projects, if you want the project to live more than 10 years, you might want to have a good test suite in order to make sure that you don't ship regressions. If you like those tips, you can check out my web course online called Writing Effective PHP. This course is actually designed to make you write effective PHP code. You have rules to write robust, safe, and maintainable code. If you sign up right now, you have a discount when the course gets realized. Thank you so much.
It's time for our questions, so let's see how much do we have. Whoa. Knock yourself out.
Yeah, humans are not food, so I think the first one is answer it.
Okay.
How to mock final classes? This is a great question that I often hear when I do this presentation. Now, I'm going to show you my vision on this, and you might want to accept it or not. In my opinion, when you need to mock final classes, that's indicative that you need an interface on that. Typically, I believe that the testing granularity should be high enough, which means that you only mock external dependencies, database, HTTP requests, and others. If you need to mock a final class, that means that you need an interface on that. All right? Of course, this is discussable. It's just my vision on it. So, why I don't like the idea of code describing itself? The problem of having code that describes itself is that on non-typed languages, the signature is not enough. Which means that, yes, you still can have types, but you need to document the behavior. If you don't write the behavior, people don't know how to interact with your method. And that can lead eventually to a breaking change, right? So, yes, the code can document the signature, the way of using it. Still, people need to rely on the behavior. And you as open source developer, if you change the behavior, is a breaking change. What did you send? Dollars or euros? Why not throw a domain exception like negative value? That's definitely a good thing. Never throw generic exceptions. You should always throw domain exceptions, such as negative value exception. That was just to make the live coding a little bit more simple. It's pretty opinionated. I'm not convinced. It's all metrics. So the default preset is definitely opinionated, based on my understanding on how code quality is. Still, for the frameworks, I do load presets that match the idiomatics of your framework. I'm going to give you two examples. Laravel framework doesn't like type-ins, which means that I do remove all the type-in validation within the Laravel framework. But for example, on my preset by default, I say that you should declare strict types at the beginning of your file. So, a good question. How are points awarded in PHP Insight? All right. I think the question is how actually the score is built. If it is, basically I just sum the total of rules, which leads to, if I have one, if any other rule have problems, that will lead to 100% of score. If you have an issue in one, I basically mark that as a problem. So it means that you probably will not have 100%, but 99% of code quality. How to use immutable object with Doctrine ORM. Unfortunately, I don't use Doctrine ORM that much. I do know that we cannot mark classes final in Doctrine, so I cannot help you on that. I'm sorry. Strong API comments. How much do you rely on developers to follow your public API comments? Usually, we had a lot of checks like type, value, etc. This is against your rule. So, adding type-ins, which I believe is the thing you are referring here, adding type-ins is, for me, is exactly the same thing as having PHP docs. Of course, the type-ins change the behavior as you perform assertions in runtime. Still, the question got removed. Anyway, what was the question exactly? Someone remember? All right, so sorry for that. Doing work on constructors, in special throwing exception and considering bad practice, how to solve this. So This is, again, my opinionated way. I think you should not validate things on the constructor. What I do is basically I make the constructor private and I work with static factories, which means that I do create a static factory that within that static factory I'm going to validate the input from the user that I don't know. That's a plan for you, like code clean with no safety final classes by default. So my thoughts is that defensive programming is definitely for all use cases. And I want to make it that really clear, that most of the time, you don't need defensive programming. But sometimes, as I told you on the use case that I showed you in the presentation, you just need defensive programming. So it's important to keep this in mind, that you should consider those practices meanwhile in your life when you are working with projects that need defensive programming. Concerning code clean, I have seen the language code clean before. I do believe they are really strict. They have interesting features such as sealed classes, final classes by default, I think. Probably too defensive there, but I don't know the context of code clean, the projects they are working on. How does static analysis realize that you pass the string instead of integer value on the constructor? This is a great question for the creator of PHP Stand, which he was here during this afternoon. But I believe that PHP Stand, it's supposed to use reflection behind the scenes to understand the signature. It checks, all right, he's trying to pass a string here. Is the string valid within this context? And it says no. And to make you some context here, it's important to realize that PHP Stand checks type-ins, but also checks documentation. So that's why you can know what to pass there. Definitely, it's better to use value objects instead of arrays. That's definitely a good thing. Sometimes you are working in legacy code, and I illustrate that example to show you that the granularity of the public API should really thin. How PHP Inside differ from Code Sniffer? All right, this is a great question. So PHP Inside is basically something built on top of a lot of tools, such as PHP CS, PHP Lock, PHP Symfony security issues, and not the PHP MD. And what it does, and I really see the value on that, is that you just install it, and then it just works. Sometimes I have the feeling that configure those tools takes time, and it's hard, and also hard to process the results. So what I have tried to do is basically build an interface that allows you to better understand at the first glance, but also loads a preset of rules that are idiomatic for your framework. So that's the difference. Aren't tests describing behavior? Yes, definitely. Still, as an open source user, you are going not to see the tests of your open source package, do you? So probably you look at the documentation, look at the code, and you might want to know how exactly I interact with this object and how exactly he is going to realize the breaking change. How the average sequential complexity is calculated per file, per class, global, is actually none. It's actually per method, which means that I do sum the total. So basically, I calculate the sequential complexity of all methods, and later I just do an average of that. Where is the try block for the exceptions? So, if I fully understand the question, normally you want to throw exceptions when something is wrong. The try-catch should be at the software level, which means on your controller, within your domain, but not on your library, I would say. All right, should be catch at the software level, so the software can put the message within their log manager or similar. All right. All right, so this is probably the most tricky question. I'm going to do this talk within 1 month, so I'm going to be able to share the slides within 1 month. I hope you don't mind. All right? So all questions over? Thank you.